Good morning. Let me add my welcome to Andrews. It's great to see so many faces and quite a lot of new faces as well. So please stay on at the end. We'd love to get a chance to meet you personally. And welcome to Job. We've been in Job. This is our third week. We're going to be in it for 5 weeks altogether. And if you just joined us today, which I guess many of you have, just to tune into Job, you've got to imagine that life is really, really difficult for you at the moment. And of course, it might be that there's people in this group or online who are joining us who don't have to imagine that. Maybe you're in a time of real tragedy. Certainly at any one time, many people are suffering, aren't they? I remember going to a Christian conference some years ago, and they were interviewing a really experienced pastor who'd, I think, been leading a church for 40, 50 years. And they said, what have you learned about Christian ministry? What's your best advice? And his summary of the Christian life was that ordinary Christians who love Jesus and seek to walk with him have a difficult time quite a lot of the time. That's his summary, because he'd just seen the bereavements. He'd seen people made redundant. He'd seen the cancer diagnoses. He'd seen the troubled marriages. He'd seen the children who went off the rails and the parents were beside themselves with worry. He'd seen the mental illness and the Alzheimer's, and it just happens to everybody, and it happens particularly to godly Christians who love Jesus, who trust him, who seek to follow him, and yet still life goes badly. And that is what the book of Job, I think it's why it's in the Bible, because here is a man for whom life is going really badly. And if you weren't here for the beginning of Job, just as a summary, Job is a really successful man. He's quite rich. He's got a great family, huge number of children. And then he loses everything just in one day. So there's some disasters in his businesses, and he loses all of his cattle and all of his sheep, all of his donkeys, and so he's poor. And you think, you can get by and be happy if you're poor. But then he loses all of his family, his sons and daughters. In one accident, they're all suddenly struck dead. And then, as if that's not enough, he loses his health, and he's covered in festering sores with no medical treatment that can help him. And then, as if that's not enough, he loses almost his mind. And most of the book of Job, the reason it's so long, it actually only takes 2 chapters to describe his suffering, chapters 1 and 2. And then it takes most of the book to have Job wrestling with his suffering with his so-called comforters. And you might have heard the phrase, Job's comforters, and it's a kind of idiom in English to mean somebody who's not really very comforting. So he'll say, thanks a lot. Someone's trying to get alongside you and they just make it worse. So thanks a lot, you're a real Job's comforter. Because it turns out that Job's comforters just make things worse for him. Because they say to him, it must be, Job, if you're suffering like this, it must be that you've done something wrong. We live in a moral universe, and God's in charge of it, and God makes sure that he blesses people who do what's right, and he makes sure he curses people who do what's wrong. And look at your life, Job, it's all going wrong, so God must have it in for you. And they keep saying that over and over again. And we pick up chapter 19 with Job answering one of his friends called Bildad, we looked at last week. And Job answers Bildad and says, verse 2, how long will you torment me and break me in pieces with words? And verse 2 tells me that our mothers, even though they loved us when we went to school, they lied to us. I think everyone's mum said to them, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt me, as if that was going to be some sort of remedy to all playground bullying. But it turns out it's not true. Words can really hurt you. And in the book of Job, words hurt Job maybe more even than anything else. I don't want to compare the horrors, losing your children, losing your health, and they're all awful things. But the damage done by these words is almost the worst of all, because Job doubts himself, he doubts his God, he doubts his sanity. Now, to understand Job, you've got to imagine that's you. And it might not be you at the moment. Maybe life is going really well for you, in which case, great. I'm pleased for you. Life's going better for me at the moment. I didn't enjoy the pandemic very much, but I'm feeling full of optimism this autumn. and I'm in a happy place. And it might be you're in a happy place, which is great, but we won't always be in a happy place. So you've got to, maybe this is preparation for when you're in the hard place. Or maybe there's people amongst us or online for whom it's the hard place right now. In which case you relate to Job. And I want to ask this question as we start. Whom do you turn to first in a crisis? Now, when everything goes wrong, whose number do you call? And I want you to answer it in your head. I hope everyone's got someone like that. If things really go wrong, who do you lean on? And I suppose for the Christian, there's probably, maybe two answers come to mind. One is my church family, my small group maybe, or my Christian friends or my Christian family. Yeah, it's brothers and sisters in the faith who are close to us. That's a good answer. That's partly why God's put us together, so that we can bear one another's burdens. So that's a good answer. But you probably guess that isn't really the most Christian answer. The most Christian answer should be God, right? God should be enough for me. I always find it really convicting when I read that psalm that says, you're all I need. And I think, I know that's meant to be right, but I don't always feel that. So lockdown should have been great, shouldn't it? Because, it was me and God. It should be excellent. But actually, I really miss you. And that's okay. God's designed it that way, where he's put the church around us, brothers and sisters, and a Christian family around us to look out for us. But ultimately, he's the one that we can always turn to and should always turn to. But that kind of takes us into why things are so difficult for Job right now, in that the people he turns to seem like they're against him. And that's what makes suffering really hard. If you're suffering, but your friends don't take your side, maybe, you're being accused of something, or maybe you've done something wrong and they think you deserve it. And so they don't empathize, or they're against you. It's very isolating. And you think, well, at least I've got God on my side. I can turn to God. But then what if in suffering you actually start to feel maybe God's got it in for me, maybe God's against me, and then you have no one. And that's where Job is in chapter 19. His friends are against him, and he feels like God is against him. Let's just look at it with me. So he starts with his friends. How long will you torment me, break me in pieces with words? He's kind of annoyed with them, I think. He's sort of fighting back. These 10 times you've cast reproach on me. Are you not ashamed to wrong me? He's accusing them. Wake up to what you're doing. You're meant to be my friends, and actually you're slandering me. You're saying I've done something wrong, and I haven't done. Give me a break, for goodness sake. He answers his friends back, but then his sort of despair takes a turn in verse 6, because he says this, verse 6, know then that God has put me in the wrong and closed his net around me. Now, if you were here last week, we looked at this picture of God's judgment of hell in chapter 18. And Bildad described hell as being like a net or like a trap. And he said, it's as if God's a hunter and he goes out to catch an animal, and he lays a net and he puts it under the leaves so no one can see it. And there's a sort of hidden snare rope that the animal doesn't see. And the animal wanders into the rope and suddenly the net closes around him. That was how Bildad described hell. And now Job is using the same language to describe how he feels. He says it's like I'm in a kind of living hell right now. And God is the one who's put me there. And these are really scary verses, if they're right. Verse 8, he has walled up my way so that I cannot pass. You've got to imagine these in your mind's eye. You're walking along through life, and then you find your way's blocked, and you try and turn another way, and that way's blocked, and it turns out there's a wall all the way around you. You're trapped, and God built that wall, he says. Or verse 9, he has stripped from me my glory and taken the crown from my head. He breaks me down on every side, and I'm gone. My hope he's pulled up like a tree. So vivid, isn't it? You're trying to get roots down in life. And every time you try to put your roots somewhere, it's ripped up. And maybe you can relate to that if you've been trusting in a relationship and the relationship's broken down, or You were trusting in a relationship and the person's died. I went last night to a kind of memorial dinner for my next door neighbour who died at the beginning of lockdown. And his wife hadn't been able to have a big gathering until yesterday. And that feeling of the roots of my life have been ripped up, the one I trusted in. And yet it's God who did it. God built the wall around me. God ripped up the roots. It gets even scarier. Verse 11, he has kindled his anger against me. He counts me as his adversary. I guess that's the fundamental question, isn't it? Do you think that you and God are friends? Or do you sometimes feel that you might be enemies? Actually, the Bible says that by nature, all of us are God's enemies without Jesus. But maybe you felt that somehow. I'm just not sure God's on my side here. Maybe he's taking the other side. And if you're going to pick a fight with anyone, then God is the most frightening person in the world to pick a fight with. Just look at the language of verse 12. His troops come on together. They've cast their siege up against me. They encamp around my tent. I guess this is the kind of thing that's going on in Afghanistan at the moment, or was going on like 2 or 3 weeks ago when the fighting was at its most intense. And you had armies coming and troops coming and people surrounding a village. But imagine you looked at it and said, whose army is that? Can we take them on? Are they weaker than us? We've got enough rocket launchers to defeat them. Oh, it's God's army. Oh, bother. Or you say something probably more colourful than that. If God is fighting, obviously he's going to win. There's an irony, isn't there, in the Bible that actually people who live as God's enemies aren't really scared of him at all. And there's lots of people in the world that defy God openly. And the idea of God fighting, they just scoff at it. Well, who is God anyway? Do I even believe in God? Do I even believe in judgment? Do I believe in hell? And they just laugh it off easily. But for the Christian, these are terrifying things because the Christian does believe in God. And the Christian does believe in his power and his anger and in hell. And so this is a particularly Christian kind of torment, I think. The God who is in charge of the moral universe seems to have taken the opposite side to me. Have you ever felt that? Have ever things gone ever so wrong that you feel God maybe is against you? And then he knows this alienation from his friends, but he says that's God's doing as well. Verse 13, he has put my brothers far from me. Those who knew me are wholly estranged from me. My relatives have failed me. My close friends have forgotten me. You may know, we talked about Job's comforters already, or so-called comforters, and they're no help. And he says, well, that's God's doing. And if you were here at the beginning of the series, we saw that Job's wife was no help. And Job says, that's God's doing as well. God has isolated me from everybody else, so I'm really on my own. You're not with me, and God's not with me. And then I think verse 21 is sort of extra poignant, really, extra sad. Verse 21, have mercy on me, have mercy on me. If you just heard those words, who would you think a Christian was talking to? Have mercy on me, have mercy on me. If they were, I think they're Roman Catholic, they might be praying to Mary. If they were a biblical Christian, you think they're praying to God, right? Have mercy on me, O God. You'd assume that's how it goes. But he doesn't say that. Have mercy on me, you my friends, because the hand of God has touched me. And let's just think about this for a minute. This is a really hopeless appeal. God's against me, so would you help me, please? It's obviously not going to work, is it? If you've got the creator of the universe is against you, and all of his armies and all of his walls, and he's pulling out your roots. And your friends aren't going to be able to help, but it just shows how desperate he is. Well, God's not my friend. Will you be my friend? Sort of very poignant, I think. And it might be you can't relate to that right now, but I'm guessing there'll be a time in most of our lives when we will be able to. That's what we find in the Bible, and especially when we're talking about the book of Psalms. Really strong Christians in the book of Psalms, like King David, has times when he feels like this. And it's true all the way through the Bible. Even the Lord Jesus has a time when he feels like this in Gethsemane. So it might be you've experienced it, maybe you will experience it later. But actually, Job is wrong. Now, we have a perspective on Job that he himself doesn't have, because we, in chapter 1 and 2, got to glimpse what was actually going on behind the scenes in the heavenly control room. And it turns out God is not against Job, quite the opposite. God thinks very highly of Job. God keeps saying, actually in heaven, he says, have you seen Job? Job is a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns from evil. God says that twice in chapter 1 and 2. Job, yeah, he's great. He fears me. He turns. We said a couple of times, it's not that Job is sinless. No one is sinless. But he's repentant. So when he sins, when he's in the wrong with God, he turns away from it. He turns back to God. He says, forgive me. He says the confession, that, like we said at Grace Church Greenwich, and he means it. Lord, forgive me. And so he's in the right with God. And actually, it is Satan who is his adversary, his enemy. And it's the hand of Satan in chapter 1 and 2 that's against him. But Job doesn't know that. So we know that because we got a glimpse into heaven. Job doesn't know that. And I think that's a great reminder to us that we don't know everything, and everything is not always as it seems. The person you think that God's got it in for, they get cancer young. Yeah, and it turns out that they're the person that God thinks the most highly of. I can think of a couple of people like that who are candidates for that. Doesn't seem like it. You wouldn't guess. It's not like they're rich or not like their family's flourishing. It's not like their health is good. You wouldn't realize that. But it turns out, actually, there's somebody that God thinks very highly of indeed. But they don't see that. So when you suffer, it can feel like God is against you. It's not actually true in Job's case, but it feels like it is. And so he's got no one. But, point 2 on the handout, but God is for the Christian. And this is how we know. Job has this sudden realization. And I want to add to my question. I asked, whom do you turn to first in a crisis? And my second kind of related question is, when do you look to him or her to resolve the crisis? Who do you turn to, and when? And I think the answer is, well, I turn to my friends, or I turn to God, but I want it solved now. And that's not going to happen for Job. I mean, he's very ill. He's bereaved. He's destitute. Everything is wrong. And I think one of the struggles of depression is you can't kind of see your way out of it. You can only see now. I remember a few years ago I was very down, and a friend said to me, and it's not always going to feel like it does now. And I know that kind of made sense, theoretically, but I just couldn't hear it because all I could see was now. And the key thing for Job is that he looks beyond now into the future. And that is the key. And we'll see, I think, again and again in the Bible, that is the key. That for the Christian, things don't always make sense now, but they will make sense then. And if you were here last week, that was the point of last week's sermon as well. I think it's going to keep being the point of the sermons in Job. It is going to make sense in the end. And here is Job's great realization. Look at verse 23. And I love these words. And some of you will be singing them in your head. And I'm not going to sing it. If you don't know the tune, I'll send it to the church WhatsApp later. But some of you know these words as they appear in Handel's Messiah, sung by a soprano very beautifully, which is why it would be a travesty for me to attempt them. But they're great. He says this. He gets this realization. Verse 23. Oh, that my words were written. Oh, that they were inscribed in a book. Oh, that with an iron pen and lead they were engraved in the rock forever. That's the first clue that Job realizes that the solution is going to be a long-term solution. I'm not going to get it right now, but I want this kind of recorded so that in the future, when everything's sorted out, then it can be sorted out. Please put it down somewhere permanent to wait for that day, he says. And here's his insight. Verse 25. This is a bit with the tune. I know that my Redeemer lives, or liveth, if you know the Messiah, Handel's Messiah. And at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself. My eyes shall behold him, not anyone else. My heart faints within me. There's a load of stuff here, and I've just put it in bullet points. I basically just spread the verse out into 5 things because it says a lot of things. But this is what the Christian knows in that moment. He knows that he has a redeemer. Redemption in the Bible, it means somebody who will turn what is lost into something that is found. He'll turn debt into riches. He'll turn slavery into freedom. To redeem a situation, we have the word in English, don't we? It means to sort of sort it out. I know that the person who will sort it out lives, he says. He's got a redeemer. Now, you look at some of the commentaries in on the book of Job, some scholarly commentaries, and they scoff at the idea that we know who this is. So Job just means, I'm sure there's someone who's going to help me. I mean, my wife's not going to help me, and my mates aren't going to help me. A fat lot of good they are, my Job's comforters. But there's got to be someone. And they just think, that someone somewhere is going to take my side, which I think is a very unpersuasive reading. Like, how does he know that everybody's actually close to him, is against him? The Christian answer is that his Redeemer has got a capital R and he's got a name that begins with J, and we all know who it is. And it's Jesus. I mean, he doesn't know everything about Jesus. He doesn't know Jesus will be born in Bethlehem. He doesn't know all the details of how Jesus will die on a cross. But he knows that there is a rescuer, a divine rescuer, a rescuer from God, whose name, it turns out, is Jesus. And he knows that this Redeemer lives and will return. I know my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. So his hope is based on a person, Jesus, and it's based on a future. Now, I think one of the reasons that the Old Testament scholars sort of scoff at the idea that it could be Jesus is because they don't believe that in the Old Testament people knew about the resurrection. They think it's a sort of New Testament surprise. But actually that's because they didn't read the Old Testament very carefully. It turns out all over the Old Testament there is a hope of life after death in God's hands. And that's the reason I put this little box I called it aside, life after death in the Old Testament. And I was getting more and more angry with some of these skeptical scholars and said the list kept getting longer and longer, and I was sort of turning back forth in my Bible. I'm sure this isn't even exhaustive, but this is quite a lot of them. So, for example, in 1 Kings and 2 Kings, people who are dead come back to life. I mean, they actually physically do. So I thought that should be clear enough evidence for the Old Testament scholar. In the Psalms, the songwriters, they look forward to God rescuing them from death. In Psalm 73, it's the sort of most Job-like psalm. He says, things don't make sense now. Good people suffer and bad people get away with it, but it's not going to be like that in the future. And he looks forward to God's rescue in the future. Isaiah talks about the day when God will swallow up death forever and raise the dead. Ezekiel talks about a valley full of dry bones. And God asked Ezekiel, these dry bones, do you think they've got any chance of walking around the valley? And he's like, and he doesn't say no because he thinks God might have a trick up his sleeve. But he thinks, look, let's face it, these have been dead a long time. But he says, well, I don't know, God. I mean, you know, after all. And God says, well, you're right to hesitate because they can live. And then suddenly, miraculously, in Ezekiel's vision, these bones take on muscles and skin and then start walking around as God's breath comes into them. He raises the dead. In Daniel is the first to describe death just like sleep. And if you're asleep, you'll wake up again. And Daniel says, many who are sleeping in the dust of the earth will awake. Genesis 22, I wouldn't have thought of this one, but this is the one that Hebrews thinks of. This is where God asked Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. People find it a very difficult chapter. How could God ask for a human sacrifice? But Abraham goes, well, okay, if God's asked for it, I'll go through with it. And in the end, it doesn't happen because God interrupts him. So it's just a test. But the book of Hebrews says, the reason that Abraham was going to go through with it is because he knew that God could raise the dead. So if Isaac did die, God would just bring him back again. I mean, Abraham knew that right at the beginning of the Bible. And then Jesus says that Moses knew it. And Jesus talking to some Sadducees who don't believe in the resurrection, which is why they're sad, you see. I can't resist that joke every time we do it. They didn't believe in the resurrection. And Jesus says, haven't you even read the book of Moses? Haven't you even read Exodus when God appeared at the burning bush and said, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's not the God of the dead, but of the living. So it's basically everywhere in the Bible. I mean, it's in Genesis, it's in Exodus, it's in Kings, it's in Psalms, it's in Ezekiel, it's in Daniel. And so all the way through the Bible, people have known that God can raise the dead. And here is his hope in Job. I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the end, he will stand on the earth. And I think a Christian reads it and says, I know who that is. I mean, Job didn't know his name, but I do. He's called Jesus. And Jesus gets through death, and he comes back. And my hope is going to be based on that future. It doesn't make sense now, but it is going to make sense then. See if you can spot the connection between verse 25 and verse 26. Just look down. What's the logic that takes you from verse 25 to verse 26? I think it goes like this. Verse 25, my Redeemer lives. Verse 26, I'm going to live. That's the logic. If he comes through death and stands on the earth on the last day, then I'm going to get through death and stand on the last day. Verse 25, we're at verse 26. After my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I'll see God. That's the logic in the New Testament as well. If Jesus got through death, he can get you through death. If Jesus destroyed death, he destroyed death not just for himself, but for us as well. And that means not only he's beat death for me, but it means I'm going to meet him, verse 27. I will see him for myself. And then it becomes very personal. And that I'm going to, that I myself, and not another. The reason I love this, I think only the Christian has a sort of personalized hope. If you're not a Christian, right, if you don't believe in the resurrection, if you think you die and then you rot, and that's it, you can still have some kind of future hope. But it ends up being, well, I hope that in the future the world will be better for my children, or for my grandchildren, or my great-great-children. I hope that society will solve its problems, and I might contribute in some small way to humans doing better so that in the future it'll be better. A lot of my non-Christian friends have that kind of hope. But it's just not personal, because I won't be there. I mean, maybe the world will be better. I mean, it won't be better, will it? Because even if you're an atheist, then the world eventually hits the sun, because the sun goes supernova, and then the universe runs out of energy, and it's the heat death of the universe. I mean, there's no actual hope in atheism, but you have some kind of, maybe society will do better. But the Christian's got better than that, because the Christian's got a personal hope. It's going to get sorted out, and I will be there when it's sorted out. He's going to be the Redeemer, and I will see him, not anyone else, but me. And so everything's going to be okay. Just imagine this man. He's lost everything. He's lost his wealth. He's lost his children. He's lost his health. He's almost lost his mind. And it feels like God's against him, like he's in a kind of living hell already. And the key is Jesus and the future. Doesn't make sense now. But I know, he says, that he lives. He's coming back. In the end, I will see him. And it will be okay. And he's right. Job is right. I mean, at the end of Job, it gets a lot better. God restores his future. But at the end of creation, at the end of time, when God sends his son and the Lord Jesus wraps up the whole of human history, then Job is going to stand on the last day. And we'll find out God's actual verdict. Job, he's a good bloke, says God. He's one of my friends. And then, final point. Because Job realizes that in the resurrection is the proof that God is for him, he then kind of doesn't really mind, or at least he's ready to face off anyone he thinks otherwise. And it's such a contrast. Remember verse 21, God's against me, God's against me. Please, will you be for me, my friends? Will you help me out? Because God's not going to. Which is a hopeless sort of cry. It then reverses in verse 28 and 29. And he says, God is for me. You better watch out if you're against me. I mean, when you're really low and people kick you when you're down, it really hurts. And you've got nothing, I mean, all that Job has is, like, stop tormenting me. He's just sort of, he's a broken man. But when he has this hope inside him, he's ready to fight them, take them on. Look, God is on my side, and if you're not, you better watch out. It just doesn't even sound like the same man, doesn't it? Let me just read it again. Verse 21, have mercy on me, have mercy on me, O my friends, for the hand of God has touched me. Verse 28, if you say, how will we pursue him, and the root of the matter is found in him, be afraid of the sword, for wrath brings the punishment of the sword. You may know there is a judgment. It just doesn't sound like the same guy. He's from broken down in the ditch to suddenly up and fighting. Because all that makes a difference in the end, all that matters in the end is which side is God on. And it doesn't seem like he's on your side when you're suffering. But you look at Jesus' death and resurrection, at your forgiveness, at the defeat of death, at the promise of Jesus' return, at the knowledge that there's a last day when God puts everything right, and it really puts steel into you. And you say, with the Apostle Paul, if God is for us, who can be against us? Which doesn't mean no one is going to be, but it just means if they are, I'm ready to take them on, because God is on my side. And here's, I suppose, a summary in a couple of words of this chapter. What do you need when you're suffering? You need Jesus. I mean, without Jesus, I don't know where you would be. If you didn't know the resurrection hope, if you didn't know Jesus and the resurrection, all you've got is this life. And if this life goes wrong, well, that's it, isn't it? You need Jesus. But you need Jesus and you need the future. His resurrection, your resurrection, the last day, his return, when you meet him. And if you're a Christian who's suffering, you've got to cast your mind forward. I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God. And I'll see him myself, not anyone else. My heart faints within me. We're going to take a short pause just to reflect ourselves, and then we're going to pray together.